All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We're really excited to be here with all of you to celebrate the brand new book, Copaganda: How Police and the Media Manipulate Our News. We're here with the author, Alec Karakatsanis. You're going to correct me, I apologize, in conversation with Kamau Franklin, who we are claiming, even though he's a New Yorker, we're trying to really make him an Atlantan at this point. Um, and Alec is an incredible writer. He's written other books that we're also going to talk about, including Unusual Cruelty: The Complicity of Lawyers in the Criminal Injustice System. He began his career representing people accused of crimes who could not afford an attorney. He founded the Civil Rights Corps, an organization that challenges systemic injustices in the U.S. legal system. In the last decade, the organization's work has freed hundreds of thousands of people from illegal confinement in jail cells, reunited hundreds of thousands of family, returned tens of millions of dollars to marginalized communities, and advanced inspiring alternatives to punishment as a means of preventing and addressing social harm. He was named the 2016 Trial Lawyer of the Year by Public Justice for designing and litigating landmark constitutional challenges to cash bail and modern debtor prison practices across the United States. So the book we are here to celebrate tonight is Copaganda, as I said, but Unusual Cruelty is also an amazing book. Alec lives in Washington, D.C. with a community of wonderful friends, family, weird paintings, a garden, and his rock collection. So welcome to you, Alec. We're so glad you're here. And he's here tonight. Yes, he's here tonight with Kamau Franklin. Kamau is the founder of Community Movement Builders. He's been a dedicated community organizer for over 30 years. For 18, Kamau was a leading member of a national grassroots organization dedicated to the ideas of self-determination and the teachings of Malcolm X. He spearheaded organizing work in areas including youth organizing, police misconduct, and developing sustainable urban communities. Kamau has coordinated community cop watch programs, liberation schools for youth, electoral and policy campaigns, large-scale community gardens, organizing collectives, and alternatives to incarceration programs. Kamau was an attorney for 10 years in New York with his own practice in criminal, civil rights, and transactional law. He now lives here in Atlanta with his two children. So I want to say welcome to all of you. Welcome to our folks who are watching online. If you would like to ask a question online, you can do that at any time by just putting it in the chat, and we'll bring it into the room when the time comes. And for all of our folks who are physically with us, welcome, folks. Come on in, grab a seat anywhere. I'll bring a mic around to you when the question and answer time is upon us, and we would love for you to engage with these two amazing folks. So I'm going to kick it over to Kamau now, and we'll get right into it. Thank you all once again for being here.
Thank you for having us. Appreciate being here. First, I want to start off that I'm jealous no one has ever given me an award for my legal practice. So to hear that you won all those awards, this is why I got out of the law, right? And I went back to organizing. But I wanted to start off because I think many of us who are organizers instinctively understand the concept and the term propaganda. But I like to always to start with the basics. And in your book, you mention the jobs of propaganda, and you say them as the following: narrowing our understanding of the problem, manufacturing fear, promoting punishment as the solution. So can you talk a little bit about propaganda in terms of what it is and what it's meant to do?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me here. It's really wonderful to be here with you in Atlanta, Charis Books, and Kamau, thank you for coming out and doing this event with me. Do I sound okay? It feels very loud. I guess I can really appreciate my own voice. So for me, and I guess, I have written a book on the subject, but I actually don't think of my own view on propaganda as necessarily being, the only, or even, the right one or anything like that. But the way I've thought about it, at least for the purposes of the book, is first narrowing our conception of safety and narrowing our conception of threat. So propaganda has us feeling very afraid of only some of the things that might potentially harm us out in the world, and kind of oblivious to many of the other things that actually are causing far more harm. So propaganda in particular wants us afraid of poor people, of people of color, particularly Black people, of immigrants, and of strangers. Right, that's a really important one that we'll see in a few minutes. But it has us afraid of, walking into a Walgreens and having a stranger do some retail theft or sort of a stranger sexual assault on the street or something like that. Even though the vast bulk of violent harm and sexual harm in our society occurs between people who know each other. But there's reasons that the punishment bureaucracy doesn't want to focus on that. Most people don't associate the police, prosecution, and prisons with violent or sexual harm by people who are in a relationship with each other in some way. So it has us focused on those things, but it has us ignoring things like wage theft, which causes about $50 billion in harm every single year, which is about 5 times all police reported property crime combined. Or tax evasion, which is $1 trillion a year, or securities fraud, $800 billion a year. We're talking about orders of magnitude greater than all of the other property crime that police focus on. But it doesn't stop there. It's Copaganda does not have us concerned with air pollution, even though it kills 100,000 people in the US every year. That's 5 times all homicide combined. Yet we're not getting push alerts on our phone from the AJC or the New York Times every time a company is caught dumping stuff into the air. Or water pollution. There's millions of illegal criminal acts of water pollution every single year. There's the great plastic littering epidemic, right? So much plastic is illegally spewed into our natural environment that all of us sitting here today have about a spoonful of plastic in our brains. These are horrific problems that are affecting every one of us, and they're not conceived of as public safety problems in the news. So that's the first, sort of function. I think the second function that you mentioned is having narrowed our conception of safety and threat always makes us more and more and more afraid of those narrow range of things. So that's why over the last 25 years, in all the public polling, people constantly think crime is up, even though almost every single one of those years crime has been down. It's also why, if you look at the inside those polls, like, people are more accurate about crime in their own neighborhood. So if you ask them, what about crime in your neighborhood? They say, well, crime in my neighborhood isn't up, but crime elsewhere is up. So they're not necessarily that accurate about crime in their own neighborhood. There's all these other phenomena going on, like Nextdoor and neighborhood listservs and the Citizen app, and just people are consuming news that's making them scared. But they're much more accurate than when their experience is mediated through the mass media, which is a really important point. And then the third, I think, most important point is that when you've narrowed people's conception of threat and you've made them more and more afraid, they're much more likely to support authoritarian and repressive solutions, especially solutions designed to target those groups that they're really afraid of. And every single problem becomes conceivable only in relation to the solution being more punishment. And even the problem of police violence. There's some really great research I cite in the book by the incredible economist at Duke named Bokhar Ba. And Bokhar found that in the wake of police violence against Black people in particular, the stock prices and value of policing industry companies goes up. It's really important. You might think, a lot of liberal people I've talked to think, well, in the wake of police violence, police industry stocks should go down because, like, police are, caught doing something really horrific and people are, less popular. But actually, the markets understand something very important, which is that the punishment bureaucracy is so effective at framing itself as a solution to every problem that it has figured out ways of turning even its own violence into more and more investment in it, whether it's technology or training or whatever. So every single problem, and this, by the way, this idea that punishment and the punishment bureaucracy in particular is the solution to all of these threats is like a modern day flat earther movement, right? It's completely contrary to all of the scientific evidence. What we know throughout other countries and throughout history is that the levels of interpersonal harm in a society, notice I'm not saying crime, I'm just saying the levels of interpersonal harm, and also by extension, the levels of violence and crime generally, are much more associated with things like the levels of inequality in a society, or poverty, or access to healthcare, or safe places to live, or early childhood education is a big one. Exposure to toxins like lead, another huge one. Things like levels of isolation and loneliness versus levels of community connection, toxic masculinity. These are the actual drivers of harm. It's just laughable. It's like all of the major news outlets are engaged in like a really profound level of like climate science denial. They're just completely denying the evidence when they juxtapose things like violence with something like bail reform or sentencing policy or police patrols or things like that.
I think so the book starts off in 2020, and you could have done a media study, or you did a media study. You could have done a historical study that obviously went back hundreds of years or since the beginning of police. But you chose sort of a modern inflection point of 2020, post the Floyd uprisings, a time period when people were saying defund the police, alternatives to police, abolish the police. And then for those who haven't gotten a chance to read the book yet, it's sort of a media study of how they continue to control the narrative and the sources of both academic study and again news media study. And this was like, some of it, being an organizer at the time, I got this. You see Biden shouting out. This is post 2020, but shouting out, "We don't need to defund the police. We need to fund the police more, or refund the police," to standing ovations on both sides of the aisle, right? So part of your study is basically how the establishment or the ruling class, both Democrat and Republicans, use propaganda as a way to sort of reinforce power. In your book, you focus more on what we would consider liberal media than conservative media. Can you talk a little bit about why that was important, to focus on liberal media? And we're going to get a little more deeply into the ways in which they did it in 2020. But why did you want to start at 2020 as opposed to another period? And what were you trying to get out of that?
So I don't know that I have a great answer for this. It's sort of when I started really archiving and documenting in real time. I probably don't even have the skills necessary to do any kind of a scholarly history of the topic, right? And other people have done such incredible work historically on this, including one of the books that has most impacted my own thinking, which is Policing the Crisis by Stuart Hall and a group of other scholars in Birmingham, England, at the Cultural Studies Center that Stuart Hall ran, which really, it's very long and very dense, but I highly recommend the book Policing the Crisis because it's probably the best book I've ever read on the topic, and it's describes the creation of the term mugging in 1960s, 1970s England as a way to for the judiciary and the police and the media and the sort of symbiotic relationship that they all shared in service of the ruling class in England, the way that they weaponized sort of a series of moral panics against Black immigrant youth, mostly from Jamaica, and other British colonies in service of a right-wing agenda, and how that led to the rise of Margaret Thatcher. It's incredibly relevant to our time now. But anyway, and Stuart Hall's an incredible, Marxist, Jamaican British thinker, and so the work has been done historically. I was actually most interested in what I think of as like a counter propaganda intervention in this moment, and the book actually arose out of, this is kind of maybe embarrassing, but just Twitter threads that I had started to do, and I was getting all of these notes from teachers, from organizers, and in fact, most of the Twitter threads that I did were actually organizers writing to me with like a letter, with like an article from their local news saying, "Can you help us unpack this, or can you say some stuff about this because it validates kind of what we're saying," or journalists. So journalists from the New York Times would send me something saying, "Hey, my colleague just published this. Can you take a look at it? I'd like to post it on our internal Slack channel. Can you?" So like I was getting all of these requests. And I was also getting a lot of notes from people in prison. I don't know how they were necessarily, how it was spreading throughout. I don't have a good sense. I understand, we sent a lot of my book, and we'll talk a little bit later about how we have free books for anybody in prison. But I don't know exactly how the Twitter was spreading. But people were using my Twitter threads inside prisons. So I started to think of the Twitter threads as kind of like a contemporary propaganda archive. And I was really interested in how do we intervene right now in this incredibly effective propaganda operation through which liberal elites in particular are manufacturing consent for right-wing authoritarian policy. Now that gets to the second part of your question, because I'm actually interested in like how can this stuff be useful right now in movement, in struggle. I was a little bit less interested in redocumenting the sort of whole history of it, but you know, as I was doing this, you know, I had to confront this question, like, well, what about the right wing? Because what the right wing is doing is incredibly important. The right wing information and misinformation ecosystem is enormously consequential. It's very, very well funded, and it's very effective. And for maybe a couple of reasons, I didn't focus on that. Number one, I think we all have to think about who our potential audience is and who listens to us and what our skills are, and the kinds of skills and networks and relationships that I have are not that conducive to challenging the political economy of the right-wing information ecosystem. So I sort of focused on the subject matter in the book, which is really the role of liberal institutions, not just the news. I think some of my favorite chapters in the book are about the role of universities and professors in validating and normalizing a lot of this stuff, but also nonprofits. Mm-hmm. We have to understand the role that most nonprofit and academic work in this field, as well as mass media, play as sort of, in my view, counterinsurgency operations, designed to get people to acquiesce in policies that are completely unjustifiable according to their own values. But I wasn't interested in the right wing stuff, in part because I didn't think I would be an effective person to really take that on, and in part because it's actually not as intellectually interesting to me. Mm-hmm. I think what I was more interested in doing was, yes, understanding what's happening on Fox News and the New York Post and Newsmax, but trying to show people who think of themselves as well-meaning and liberal people and progressive people toward the center and the left, that what they are consuming every day in the nightly news in Atlanta and the New York Times and NBC News is basically the same thing. Mm-hmm. And really good propaganda has to understand its audience. And I think that MSNBC and the New York Times are normalizing, accepting, adopting, encouraging, validating the exact same underlying messages as Fox News, but they're using language and framing designed to be most persuasive to their audience. That's really hard to see. It's really hard for a lot of people. I was just in San Francisco, and it's very, very hard for a lot of the people who think of themselves as liberal and progressive there. And I use that term because, I think a lot of what they support is really grotesque and horrific and not in any reasonable conception of the term progressive. But they have a really hard time seeing why Ezra Klein is so dangerous and why the abundance agenda that he's pushing as a neoliberal rebrand, why is it that the Kochs might be interested in funding this, right? Like, what people have a really hard time, and that's why California is marketing the greatest expansion of control and state repression of people with mental illness in modern history as the care court. It's why the mayor of San Jose is framing his new policy to lock up and cage and put metal chains on unhoused people as a policy to end suffering. There's a thing that the mass liberal establishment does, mm-hmm. which is put this veneer over really harmful and discredited and dystopian stuff. And I was most interested intellectually in attacking that, and also it felt like that's my kind of main value add.
Yeah, I would say, again, in terms of my own recent organizing with the Cop City stuff, part of the struggle has always been, what about the so-called progressives and liberals, particularly for somebody like me who considers themselves a radical, not part of either camp, but knowing if there's a camp that somebody like us has to influence, it is the progressives. But the progressives also locked into the democratic kind of worldview, which, like you said, it's the acceptable edge of empire or of establishment politics, right? And one of my individual running lines was the one thing that the Republicans and Democrats agree with is cops and capitalism, right? So for them, the framework, you're right, is to keep people in a sense feeling like they are the ones who care more about society. They're the ones who are looking for solutions, but they're looking for common sense solutions, or they're doing common sense things that are not crazy like these Republicans, or not crazy like these leftists off to the corner. And so it's almost like that's the group in the middle, or because they basically are in the middle, that folks are looking to capture or to move, particularly for people like me outside of the Democratic orbit. But the propaganda, right, the propaganda slash propaganda is very strong in terms of what people see the solutions are. So that for us, that was just something that we continually battle. Like the mayor and their partnership with the governor, but the mayor, the use of the police force, the idea that the police were always fighting on our side, those kind of things. Where even as we turned some public opinion away from Cop City, you could tell that it was the struggle for that was extremely difficult because people were so linked into believing that the cops were the only solution to so-called crime or whatever like that.
I think what you're saying is so important. I just want to highlight, like, and maybe bring Atlanta into the conversation a little bit on this point, but I've learned a lot from the work of people like Orasanmi Burton and Stuart Schrader and others who, among many others, who helped me understand counterinsurgency. And what you have to know to really understand what's happening in the U.S. right now, especially something like Cop City, you have to understand that a lot of these tactics were developed by the French and British militaries for use in Algeria and Vietnam and India, and then adopted into the U.S. military field manuals and protocols for use in Iraq and Afghanistan. Very, very sophisticated and complex strategies that basically all center around how do you divide and conquer and influence a native population. And it was really funny. Like these ex-military guys started teaching this class at Harvard a couple of years ago, and they made the mistake of talking about it as counterinsurgency. And so they had this class, a graduate student class that was going to be taught at Harvard about using military counterinsurgency in Black communities in Massachusetts. They forgot that all of the counterinsurgency tactics had already been brought into the U.S. but marketed as community policing. If they had just called it community policing, they would have been celebrated. But they made the mistake of just using the military terminology for all the same stuff. And there was this uproar and organizing against it, and Harvard had to cancel it. But it was a very interesting and funny episode. But there's a couple of really key, and then there's a bunch of global counterintelligence corporate firms that specialize in helping companies like pipeline companies, mining companies, pharmaceutical companies, various oil company, basically like, very rich industries, squelch local dissent. And you can hire these people, and they rely a lot on the counterinsurgency manuals, and it's much more complicated, but essentially there's all this writing in the right-wing military and corporate world that talks about this stuff in ways that liberals and progressives don't even think about. And so these people have, and I talk about this a lot in my separate study on I think the most effective counterinsurgency operation in modern U.S. history, which is the body camera, which we can talk about in a little bit. But they divide people into, okay, well, there's these radicals. We're never going to persuade these people. Then there's like the well-meaning progressive type people. Then there's like the people that'll kind of bigger swath of the population that'll kind of go along with whatever is the sort of, whatever's in the zeitgeist of it. That's why over half the population supported the burning of the Minneapolis police precinct in the wake of the George Floyd murder, right? That scared these elite ruling class people more than anything else in modern U.S. history, because they knew they had lost that big group of people in the middle. Then there's like the right wings, and then there's the people who they view as part of the native population who can be co-opted to sort of be the standard bearers of the establishment, but who can convince other people within their marginalized identity that this establishment people aren't so bad. Okay. Walter Rodney has written a lot about this in the context of the European development in Africa. Anyway, go into all that. why is that relevant here? Well, I think what you saw in Atlanta was you saw, and it's similar to stuff that we've seen in Washington, D.C., in San Francisco, in New York, Black mayors doing things that might have been impossible for a white mayor to do, and weaponizing identity in a way that serves the ruling class. And this is a classic counterinsurgency tactic. And it doesn't even require a giant conspiracy where everyone involved in it knows exactly what's going on at every stage. It's just a tried and true like way of the ruling class to preserve its power and wealth, etc. And so it's really important to understand that a lot of the stuff that you're seeing like in Atlanta is part of a long tradition of using members of an oppressed class to be the faces and voices to sell policies that wouldn't be palatable to an oppressed population otherwise.
Mm-hmm. So I'm gonna jump to the body cams for a quick second, only because you brought it up, because I need a lesson on this, right? So my own this is why I get liberal, and so I need to be corrected on this one, because most of my people are against body cams, and then I give a liberal argument, and I use my lawyerly argument, which and I do my lawyerly voice, and so that convinces people like, oh, he must know what he's talking about when he does it, per se, right? So my thing on body cams has been they're no solution to police violence, but as a way to document what's happening in the street while it's happening, it is better. Excuse me. It is better to have than to not to have, and then I rely on as a defense attorney. I prefer to have that visual evidence as opposed to just battling written testimony from the cops in terms of their police reports and so forth and so on. So when I weigh out, is it better for them to have or not to have, I'm for them. Why am I an idiot?
Well, I don't think you're an idiot. I think reasonable people could disagree on this, potentially. Well, maybe not on this. But so the book has a little bit on body cameras in it, but I wrote a separate, very quite long essay in the Yale Journal of Law and Liberation last year on body cameras. So if you're interested in this topic, and I talk about some of the counterinsurgency stuff in there with lots of citations because it's Yale. They require a citation for like every sentence that you give. So that will be published as a book later this year in French for some reason. But the French Canadians are a little bit behind the U.S. in the police surveillance industry, and a bunch of French Canadian organizers and activists and publishers are very worried about trends in Canada toward moving much more toward the U.S. in terms of the expansion of the punishment bureaucracy. They wanted the essay to be out in a book form in Canada as they debate this kind of stuff. And then we'll probably do it in a book in English next year, since it's already written. So if you're interested, I'm going to try to paraphrase, but I think it's profoundly important. And the body camera issue is a way of understanding so much more about our society. So in order to understand it, I think we have to take a step back to 2010, 2011 era, for years, the police, and in particular, the multi-billion-dollar police surveillance industry really wanted body cameras for police. They had a set of reasons that they wanted them. And they had a problem, though. And we'll talk about the reasons they wanted them in a minute. Their problem was they couldn't get mostly Democratic-controlled local governments, or even rural Republican-controlled local governments. They couldn't get them to spend the billions of dollars it would take to outfit every cop in the United States with a mobile surveillance camera. What were we going to do? Well, they started small. They started raising private donations to get themselves body cameras. The LA Police Foundation, and I think some of you are familiar, there's this sort of shadowy world of police foundations, which are 501c3 nonprofits. That Robert Vargas at the University of Chicago has done some incredible work on the shadowy world of police foundation spending and donations. incredible sociologist at the University of Chicago. So they got people like Steven Spielberg to donate money. They wanted them so badly, right? That should be red flag number one. Like, the police wanted them. Okay. Mm-hmm. Now, why did the police want them? And why in particular did prosecutors want them? Well, different groups had different reasons. Municipal officials wanted them because they thought giving the police a camera that they controlled might actually help reduce legal liability in civil cases. Another reason is that everyone understood that police body cameras would be looking outward, away from the cop, toward whoever the cop was looking at. And the way that they're affixed on the chest, they create this atmosphere where everything looks chaotic. It completely validates the police narrative that it was a fast-moving, chaotic scene, and like that's the main police defense in all of these cases. So the police were like, even, and by the way, the police believed in the early years, and in many places, still with good reason believe that they would be the ones that ultimately controlled things like when do we have to turn them on and off. What are the consequences for an officer of not turning them on? So they magically don't turn on in many situations, or they're not, used or whatever. But they understood something much more fundamental, which is having these videos would give them an opportunity to control virality. So virality is everything in our current information ecosystem. If you can get a video to go viral, you can get tens of millions of people to see it. If you can stop a video from going viral, you can prevent it from really making headway in the information ecosystem that we have. And so police, it's why, for example, the video, not from a body camera, but the video that police had from a car of the murder of Laquan McDonald in Chicago was buried until a judge forced them to release it years later after the mayoral election of Rahm Emanuel, right? Whereas if the police have a video of a group of undocumented immigrants committing a street crime, that gets out on the nightly news right away. Police really wanted that ability, okay? They also wanted to be able to selectively edit these videos. So these police public relations departments that I talk about in the book developed huge departments to actually manufacture and edit the body cameras so that they do various things that make the police look. I still haven't gotten to the big reasons. The two big reasons were because of the police controlling them and wearing them. Police and prosecutors saw body cameras as the greatest advancement in modern history in terms of dead to rights evidence for low-level criminal prosecutions that were clogging the courts. They were like, oh, if we have video of this trespassing or this drug possession case, we will be able to coerce guilty pleas much more quickly. It's so hard. We don't want to take all these cases to trial. We just show the defense attorney a video. Yeah. And even if it's not the crime that they were arrested for, the video might capture some other crime. And now we have a video of the person possessing this thing, and they're not going to be able to argue to a jury that, well, maybe the cop planted it or whatever. So like they understood that the main use, and that it would very rarely, and this is borne out, very rarely ever be used against the police. And it would be used in every courtroom in the country against millions of the poorest people in our society. And then the big one. The police surveillance industry is constantly trying to create a more Orwellian, dystopian, total information awareness society. So the police body camera and a surveillance camera on every cop gives them an enormous new tool. And then there's all these companies, Microsoft, Amazon, the cloud storage companies saw a huge boon, right? Because once you have hundreds of thousands of cops collecting this video, huge new needs come, not just for data storage, but for the artificial intelligence algorithms they were developing to review and document and analyze that footage. So the body cameras themselves actually aren't that expensive, but it's the perpetual contracts for maintenance and training and service and the AI algorithm licensing that is the big boon. Axon, the company that used to be called Taser that rebranded after people started Taser started killing people, they grew by billions and billions in market cap after Obama. And so what they did was they saw the killing of Michael Brown as their chance. They completely rebranded away from, they were having no success with local officials as something the police wanted. They rebranded it for liberals and progressives as accountability and transparency. Obama proposed hundreds of millions of dollars. All these governors and mayors started following suit. Everyone was saying, well, this is going to be our solution to accountability and transparency. The police were like, okay, great. Your solution to accountability and transparency is the very thing we wanted. In the face of evidence where even the federal government admits that police body cameras do not make police less violent. They do not serve the purpose that they were, right? That's just incontestable in the literature. The police, did a few studies initially that tried to show that they were less violent, and then like the more rigorous studies all showed that they weren't. So, and this also goes back again to some of the military field manuals. It's really useful for counterinsurgency and intelligence divisions to go to a protest with a camera and scan the crowd. Now you can use your facial recognition software. You can see who knows who's next to who's connected. Like, this was a huge boon for their surveillance and counter protest and counterintelligence divisions. So anyway, I could go on and on, but basically,
you can go on and on proving I'm an idiot.
Well, I think when I was a public defender, I loved the body cameras because I thought, oh, finally I can. But it actually, like so many reforms, and I talk about a bunch of them in the book. So many of the things that were pitched to us, well-meaning people who want a society of less violence and state repression as reforms, like probation and parole were reforms. Now they're the largest driver of incarceration in the United States. There's so many, and I could go on and on about those things, but so that's sort of my view.
So I have a question, going back to the book directly, or going back to this part of the book in order of my questions. Can you describe the idea of moral panic and how it ties into the density of news coverage on crime by poor people? Because that seemed to me just to be a very important topic. I wanted you to bring that out a little bit more.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked about that. I think it's maybe the most important thing. I mean, I think there's lots of interesting things in the book that I didn't know as I started researching, but this one is maybe the most important. It's not the most complicated of the propaganda tactics, but it's maybe the most important. And I think there's two related concepts. One is what I call the volume of news or the density of news. Mm-hmm. And the other is something I call the selective curation of anecdote. So do you guys remember there was, I don't know if you had similar things in the Atlanta local news, but a few years ago, there was a viral video of a shoplifting from Walgreens in San Francisco. There was like a guy on a bicycle, and it was actually quite impressive. Got a bunch of stuff and then got on the bicycle and like zoomed out the door somehow. Anyway, that got tens of millions of views. That one viral video spawned 309 local news stories around the country about that video. At the same time, there was not a single story covering Walgreens' wage theft of employees. So that got me thinking a lot about the volume of news. And the story I tell in the book also is I was doing all these constitutional civil rights cases, and we were winning these cases, and we were getting rulings that basically showed that judges were violating people's constitutional rights by the tens of thousands in some cities. Okay. And then by the millions across the country. And many of those violations were like literal federal crimes because judges knew the law and were refusing to apply it, and it's a federal crime to intentionally violate someone's constitutional rights. So I would have these calls with like the New York Times or NBC or whatever, and be saying, well, why don't you cover these massive constitutional violations? People are being separated from their children. People are being, people's pets are dying because they're stuck in jail on a money bail they can't afford. Totally illegal. People are missing their medication. People losing their jobs. It's a massive story, and they would say to me like, well, someone at the New Yorker just did a story on the money bail system like 3 weeks ago. So last year, somebody did a great expose on the Ferguson debtors prison. So like, why do you want to do one on the New Orleans debtors prison? Can you imagine like somebody saying, well, I can't cover this armed robbery in Cleveland because somebody covered a different armed robbery in Phoenix? It makes no sense. But it's crucial to understand that many of the most important issues in our society are thought of by the news media as like a story for one big investigation that might submit for the Pulitzer Prize, or, ProPublica does a big expose, and then it's like, but other things are front page news or that local headline every single day. And out of all the millions of things that happened the night before, somebody is deciding which 8 or 10 are the ones they're going to tell you about. And it just so happens that every single day, 7 of those things are things that the police bring to them, So the volume of news, the things we're getting push alerts on, the things that appear on the front page every single day, those are the things we start to think of as more urgent. So we start to think of stranger homicide, even though stranger homicide in our society is extremely rare. And in fact, of the stranger homicides, police commit at least 1/3 of them. Okay, stranger homicides are very rare. We don't think about air pollution in our community. We don't even know the person who's inspecting the air quality by the local playgrounds or the soil quality in those playgrounds does not have a PR department. It's not getting on the news every day. It's not high volume news coverage. So what does that have to do with the selective creation of anecdote? Well, another phenomenon that's related, and this is all, I promise, getting to the moral panic point. So imagine if I don't know, I played basketball in high school, and I like basketball. Somebody's a basketball. Usually my crowds who come to see me are like not sports crowds, which is fair. Sports are horrible, and at least in their corporatized form. But having said that, imagine if someone asked you to describe Steph Curry as a shooter to somebody who's never watched basketball before, or Michael Jordan. I could make a video of every missed shot in Michael Jordan's career. It would be like 9 hours long, just miss after miss after miss after miss after miss. And I showed it to this person. That person, not knowing anything more, might conclude that Michael Jordan or Steph Curry is not a good shooter. In fact, maybe the worst shooter to ever. Why is this person even in the NBA? What I've done is I've used entirely true anecdotes to create a false impression that this person is a bad shooter. So the best propaganda, particularly propaganda focused on liberals and progressives, is true propaganda. It'd be one thing if the person could show that each of the shots in the video was like AI generated and they weren't actually true. They wouldn't believe anything I said later. But so you need to use true facts, but you create false impressions with them. That's what the creation of moral panics is, using the volume of news and the selective creation of anecdote. That's what the news media did with retail theft. At a time when retail theft was down and property crime generally was at historic lows, we created a national panic over organized retail theft. They did that through selective curation of anecdote, which stories they told and in which volume. And that's actually what the news media has done with crime generally. It's what Willie Horton was about. Most people, I have this in the book, but it's surprised me, and maybe you guys are, knew this already, but it wasn't just that like the George Bush campaign like did a bunch of research and picked Willie Horton. It was that this local newspaper did 200 stories on Willie Horton. They made it a story through the sheer volume of news, and they won the Pulitzer Prize for it. People forget that part of the story. The liberal media establishment gave the people that fear-mongered about Willie Horton and took down a very successful public safety enhancing furlough program. They gave him the Pulitzer Prize for that. Anyway, that's how you create a moral panic.
Yeah.
And then of course there's all kinds of ways in which the establishment, ruling class interests weaponize moral panics to support authoritarian solutions.
Like part of your description of the volume reminds me, it's been a while since I've read Manufacturing Consent, Chomsky, and he talks about the art of propaganda is to be able to repeat something over and over and over again so that this becomes embedded in your mind, and then you don't question it anymore. And so obviously, the biggest issue of urban life is street crime. And there's no reason to question the solution to it, because also the solution to street crime is presented as more police on the street, and it's over and over and over again or whatever. So that brought that up for me. The next I wanted to ask you, so part of the what seemed to me in 2020, 2021, again, I said this at the beginning, was that the idea of defunding rose high enough because of the massive uprisings and pushback to actually be part of a public dialogue. And that seemed to me to scare the police, the authorities, like shitless, right? That they thought that somehow that they were going to, that defunding was going to happen. Now, and you talk about this in the book too, defunding never took place, right? But it sort of reached a level of where the media couldn't ignore basically the call to at least have the discussion, right? And so the media reacted in certain ways during that time period to, in some ways, put the genie back in the bottle, right? Um, and I would say you mentioned the police foundations, even as an aside, the police foundations, of course, go back many years, but because of their worry that even that this could take place, the police foundations exploded as this alternative funding source for the cops, right? Here in Atlanta, we know that because the Atlanta Police Foundation is the driver of Cop City, the driver of a lot of the surveillance that's taking place in Atlanta. And even though Atlanta is no bigger than like the 20th or 25th biggest police department in the country, the Atlanta Police Foundation is the second biggest police foundation, at least at one point it was, behind New York. So I'm curious as to the ways in which um, the propaganda system battled back against the idea of defunding to make sure that it never happened.
Yeah, I mean, much of the book is really about that. And there's so many ways, and there's ways that are overt. There's ways that are really subtle. There's ways that I think are incredibly effective. So, take one example that I talk about in the book. The first of all, like every time a progressive person who vaguely supported reducing spending on punishment bureaucracy and investing in other things was anywhere near the public scene, whether they're running for office or elected or whatever, the coverage of them was laughable. It caricatured there was a concerted effort, and I analyze articles and show articles from major institutions. They just refused to tell the public what these people actually believed and what they were calling for. There is a really important thing is to never tell people exactly what progressives are, and that has several effects. It makes people, the casual news reader who's being told that we're reading all the news that's fit to print, makes people think progressives don't even have a plan. There's no vision. There's no specifics. It's just vague calls from it's not specific, concrete, evidence-based, workable policies. So there's a complete effort to just ignore the actual content of what people were proposing, which is an important point. There's lots of articles that just misstate and lie about and all kind and let police sources and other experts without telling you that the conflict of interest the expert had, basically critique with false talking points these progressive policies. Then there's the whole genre of story where it became that we had already tried all these progressive policies. The progressives won, and look what they did to San Francisco, or look what they did. And it's like, but actually they were never actually implemented. So to the extent you're talking about bad results that you don't like, it's actually your own policy. So then there was this revisionist history about like what actually happened. So defund started getting blamed for things, even though there hadn't been any defunding. And so I have all these funny. I mean, I try to make the book funny because like these are such bleak topics, but some of the stuff is really funny, genuinely funny, because they're blaming things that never happened for other things that never happened based on reasons that don't make any sense. And so there's all kinds of different tactics that they use, and each chapter
was the idea that now we had a new crime wave. And can you talk a little bit about that as a propaganda tool? Because you mentioned that in one of the chapters that even though so-called crime, right, has been at historical lows for a while, this was used as a propaganda tool to beat back any suggestion that less cops would somehow not endanger the public.
Yeah, so at every key moment, there's the creation of a new panic about a different kind of crime. And one week there was this viral story about train theft that dominated the news for a few days. Theft from trains. There was all the retail theft stuff. There was a carjacking panic around the time DC was considering reducing the mandatory minimum sentence for carjacking from the current level, which nobody ever got, to another level, which was still more than anyone ever got. It would have no effect. But the panic around carjacking in DC got so severe that Biden vetoed and the congressional Democrats overturned a democratically passed law in D.C., celebrated by Tom Cotton and all these other authoritarians. So all because of this carjacking. But there's panic after panic after panic at key moments where it looks like somebody might be, so there was the recall of the progressive prosecutor in San Francisco. There was the panic in Los Angeles prior to the election unseating the progressive DA there. There was the attempt to do a similar thing in Philadelphia. There was the midterm elections. I mean, over and over and over again, anytime it seemed like somebody might have or every time there was a city council person in New York City running for something on a progressive platform, it was, two cops were shot in this person's district, and there's a wave of gun violence, right? Or subway theft or crime or homelessness is out of control. There was all these just one after one after one after one.
Yeah, I know we have a few minutes left before we start to get to questions from the audience. You talk about the social cost of policing, right? So we've talked about propaganda as in the damage of the idea that more cops will solve our problems, but you also hit on the problems that cops cause, and or the social cost of thinking that cops will solve the issues, if not the issues of poverty, but basically they're this bulwark against the poor hordes, reaching the other folks or whatever. Can you talk a little bit about the social cost of policing on society?
Yeah, so I think it's also important to understand the context within which this usually comes up. I talk about the social cost of policing within the context of critiquing academic studies that purport to justify more police. And there's a small cabal of, I think, quite dangerous and unrigorous and in some cases dishonest researchers who have managed through their web of relationships with the police and with establishment journalists to purport to have some consensus that experts believe that more police and more investment in police will make us safer. And this is crucial, that the benefits of that outweigh the costs. But if you actually go look at even their own biased, unrigorous studies, none of them purports to actually count the costs, let alone weigh them. It's really incredible to see such an ethical breakdown. Like it'd be like hiring somebody to install a furnace in your house, and they bring a model. It's like, this is the best model. This thing will heat your house up and cool your house down. It's incredible. Just like best on the market, without even asking the question of, does it also spew carbon monoxide into your home that's going to kill your family? Like, it's like, at least ask the question. Like, maybe there's some acceptable level of carbon monoxide. Maybe weigh that against how great the heater is. It's like, well, let's weigh it, right? But it's really incredible. Or this thing, will have an energy bill that costs you, half of your income, right? Like, so your house may be 86 degrees in the winter, but like it's costing you, right? So, but like that's literally what some of the leading criminologists in the United States were doing. They were doing purported research that talked about the benefits of police. And then they were saying in their own papers and in the news media that the social overall benefits outweighed the costs. But they were never counting or even considering the costs. So let's talk about some of the other way this comes up is in its standard trope in like the New York Times and mainstream news media to portray the only cost to sort of portray policing as this trade-off between safety and like discrimination, safety and our egalitarian values, right? It's just assumed, by the way, that like more order, more police, more prisons is more safety. And so only civil libertarians actually oppose the police because like it's a value trade-off. And like, and there's all kinds, that's a very insidious form of propaganda because it's based on a lie. And it also, of course, in a contest between the safety of your children and like your abstract values, like you're going to choose the safety of your children any day of the week. You'd be a monster not to, right? So, but like they surgically exclude anybody talking about other costs, like more violence down the line to our children, or any number of other things we'll get to in a minute. And so this lack of understanding of the actual costs to all of us of more policing is one of the main propaganda functions of the mainstream news. It's just completely excluded. So I think there's the obvious costs. There's the cost that most people are familiar with from mass incarceration. Arrests are incredibly damaging. Arrests actually make people more likely to commit crime in the future. They are brutal events. People are strip searched. People are handcuffed. People are ripped from their children. People are traumatized for life. There's also, obviously, these are all happening in a discriminatory way on the basis of class and race and identity and disability and all kinds of other metrics, right? Those are, then there's the mass incarceration that follows. Like, I think those are pretty well understood. There's a deeper layer of costs that I think is also pretty well understood. Whereas, maybe you could achieve perfect safety in like a world like Orwell's 1984 if there were a cop stationed in everyone's bedroom. Maybe like in that even if police weren't much more likely than other people to commit sexual and physical assault, maybe you had a surveillance camera in everyone's bedroom like they do in 1984, maybe there would be less certain types of crime. But like, is that there's a trade-off to sort of the basic features that make a human life worth living, including the ability to have moments to oneself and privacy and to share intimate moments with people without the government watching. So what are the profound effects of like the proposal I critique in the book by these two Harvard professors who claim to be socialists and progressives? They're calling for 500,000 more cops, the greatest expansion of policing in modern world history. And, they don't even mention privacy or the effect that it would have on our society to have 500,000 more armed surveillance officers and agents. Then there's like a deeper level of cost, which most people I talk to like just don't appreciate, which is the police are a very effective right-wing political force. They dominate local politics through a variety of mechanisms. The money, the concerted effort. They also, like most local politicians, I've had dozens of judges, mayors, city council people come to me and talk to me about how the police have threatened their children. This is a silent epidemic across the country. Anyone in progressive local politics understands that they are taking a risk. Some of the stories that I've been told and some of the stories that have been actually documented in the media of this are like bone chilling. So they are a armed, highly organized, right wing group of entities that are not only infiltrated by the far right white supremacist groups, but they are operating as sort of incredibly effective symbiotic institutions with the furthest right elements of our society. So they control local politics. It's very, very rare that something that the police really care about happens contrary to their interests in the local city government. It's why even at the height of the defund movement, almost nobody defunded their police department, and the ones that did were incredibly minor on things that the cops don't care about and not eliminating any sworn officer positions, right? So and then there's like even deeper stuff, like at the height of the civil rights movement, Chicago alone had 500 police officers devoted to infiltrating and disrupting the civil rights movement. There's all this stuff that people, I mean, you obviously know this, but like a lot of people don't know the history of the way in which police, and we still do not know the history of police false flag operations and infiltration of, let's say, Cop City movement or the George Floyd uprisings or whatever. There's an incredibly sophisticated and long history of this. And so more, and then there's all the public relations stuff I talk about. And then those are all, the more money and power you give the police, the more power you're giving them to shape all of that and to infiltrate and disrupt. And because the police have opposed every major progressive social movement in modern US history, women's suffrage, LGBTQ movements, anti-war movements, economic justice movements, racial justice movements, animal liberation movements, environmental movement. I mean, like, it's a huge cost to add 500,000 more people that are opposed to all these movements. It's why it was so absurd that Obama was proposing doubling the border patrol when he was in office. You add 20,000 more border patrol agents, you are creating a political force. And people don't appreciate the political context of this enough when they're thinking about the cost of police.
Thank you for that. Appreciate that. Let's give him a round of applause. I think we have a few minutes for some questions from the audience. So if folks have questions, can they raise their hand and we'll get a mic to you?
Yeah, you're right here.
I don't know if I've ever used a mic before.
It's first time.
So you brought up the point that, as a defense attorney, you want body worn camera for like motions, which is like most of defense practice now. And you said, I think you referenced some data and you said it does not bear out that it's actually good for defendants on the whole. Can you paint like a bigger picture of why that is the case?
Well, there's far more cases where it's used against people as damning evidence of guilt on something that like our society should not be handling through punishment. Trespassing, drug possession, whatever, assault on a police officer for just moving your hand away as they're trying to arrest you. That's a crime, right? But like, it's just almost never used against police. It's used like against the poorest and most marginalized people in our society in extraordinarily high volume. And then just a little bit of a quibble, like the evidence shows that they do not make police less violent. I don't know of a study that has shown that they're like better or worse for like criminal defendants, like in particular case environments, but like overall, they don't reduce police violence. So that's the main benefit that we're supposed to be getting from them. And they also enable much more quick processing of guilty pleas. It also gives this is the real thing, right? It gives them more leverage, and that leads to higher sentences, because plea bargaining, which is what happens in most criminal cases, is just a leverage game. The more leverage you have as a defense lawyer, the lower the sentence is going to be if you plead guilty. And when you're caught on video doing something, you have a lot less leverage than when you're not caught on video doing something. So I think like that's in general why it tends to harm people, even if there are examples where body cameras have caught police committing misconduct and cases have been dismissed. There are examples of that, and those are seductive. They really are, because we want to know what happened to Michael Brown. His family wants to know. We all want to. But the other thing I didn't talk about earlier is that the body camera gets us thinking about all the wrong things. It gets us thinking about the question of who was wrong in this encounter. Was it a bad poor person or a bad black person who had a gun or looked like they were reaching for a gun, or was it a bad cop who didn't see anything threatening but still shot the person? Like, those are the wrong questions. The right questions are, why was an armed government agent in this neighborhood at this time? What were they doing? Those are much deeper questions the police don't want us talking about. Body cameras focus the discussion on the moment of a violent incident, maybe, or a moment of an arrest, and who was right and who was wrong in that moment, which is just not the right question from a social policy perspective, in my opinion. So I think there's this other harm there that I forgot to mention earlier.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Other questions?
I just thought of this, not to mention those cases where you see, what the cops were doing, why they were in the neighborhood. It brought to mind those cops. I don't remember what city it was that they were chasing that man throughout all the neighborhoods, and he was like 10 seconds away from his mother's house, and they shot him in the street and killed him, and they had the body cameras on it. And there are so many cases, you can just watch them on the fake news, and you see where they were actually guilty of what they were doing, and they still get off. And somehow the prosecutor loses the case. I mean, it's like, even if it does show you something obvious going on, you hear them talking to each other saying, kill that MF, or, take him down. and they still get off. I mean, the cameras don't provide enough evidence to sway the juries or to have them not believe a cop had some evidence. I mean, you bring the evidence in and then it doesn't, it is not necessarily going to sway the jury. Um, and
Sure.
it's just really, it's amazing. And the other case with, convincing people of craziness, I was thinking of, how the present occupant of the White House people can and his whole fan group can create tell a story over and over and over. And what came to mind was the story of, you said, pets, about the story about the Haitians supposedly killing people's pets. And you know, if you turned on corporate media, they played that story every half an hour. Somebody has something to say about that. And they're telling the public, oh, like, so if you watched MSNBC, they're telling the so-called liberal media, so they're telling the people how crazy, the MAGA people are for coming up with this, but they're saying it like 3, 4, 5 times an hour, all day long, every day for weeks and weeks and weeks. That's like the major story. So people have that proclivity, even though the press is, media is saying this is a bad story, this is a bad situation. It doesn't matter because now it's logged in, it's logged into people's minds, and this is what they think is important.
Thank you for that.
Thank you both for your time today. I definitely appreciate the point about the body cameras. I'm from Akron, Ohio, and I want to say almost 3 years ago, someone who was the brother of my high school classmate, Jalen Walker, was shot dozens of times in the back by police, and I had to stand weeks and months of conversations about what he did to deserve bullets in the back. So I deeply appreciate that point. My question is actually in the scope of organizing, because in this current moment, no matter what issues you care about, whether that's immigrant rights, queer rights, the environment, things of that nature, whatever repressive policies are being passed, they are to be enforced by the police. And so, as people resist those policies and those actions, that propaganda machine is going to kick up. And so, what instances of success have you seen in maintaining that narrative and keeping it away from where they want to redirect it? Because the distractions and the ability to misdirect, mislead, it just takes so much momentum and energy away.
I mean, I could say quickly, again, just going with the last thing that I did with Cop City was the idea of naming something Cop City. So beating back the narrative that this was some ordinary training center that was meant to enhance public safety and train the cops as if there wasn't sort of a political apparatus or agenda behind it, right? So Cop City was built, although it was a plan that was years before in terms of something that they come up with, they didn't try to implement it until the 2020 uprisings. And part of the reason that was because for the establishment, again, both right wing and liberal, they thought they lost control of both of the narrative and of people. People were out in the streets in mass. They weren't at home being good consumers. And so this idea of training the cops up even more to handle mass disturbances or mass uprisings really is the idea behind this militarized police training center, in addition to the continued over policing of Black and brown communities. So the fact that organizers and activists were able to jump out right away and to have the narrative be that this Cop City was innately bad shook them. And then we saw, similar to what you're saying, the response to it was to show all the ways in which power operates. Power will operate to actually murder organizers, activists, to charge them with RICO charges, domestic terrorism charges, to even a referendum that was meant to follow a democratic path was denied the ability to be put on the ballot. And again, these things were done by both Democrats and Republicans. And so for, and we didn't get into this discussion because we talked about the propaganda thing, but even look at the narrative around some of the struggle around folks who are fighting against the genocide of Palestinians. In a way that is propagandized and brought out into the media, despite videos over and over again from Palestine showing the continued murder of a whole population of people, right? So the idea that the establishment is strong, right, and will use all these mechanisms to control the larger public. For me, the solution is there has to be more of us out in the street, right? We can't depend on policy apparatus to be the tip of the spear of how we make change. They were most fearful of people when people were organizing and mobilizing in 2020, when they were out in the street saying that they were not going to simply go about business as usual, and even that folks are willing to break through via a COVID epidemic to be out protesting against the violence that the police were showing. So I think that, again, even though I consider it a battle, not the war, even though they built this monstrosity, one of the victories was the delaying, showing the use of the police, the convincing of people that this was not necessary. And again, we had information that showed that if this was taken to a vote, right, the so-called democratic process, our side would have won. And they knew that also, right? They knew that they could not win this at the ballot because the same people that the Democrats rely on to get out the vote for them were actually a lot of the same groups who are like, no, we're not for this, and we will mobilize to get people out to vote against this. So for me, it's about people out in the street, people organizing, joining organizations, and being part of something that's bigger than obviously just policy or, thinking that the problem will solve itself if we just vote in a Democrat. Because people will feel better about something. Some people will, no, some of us won't, but people will feel a little better. But the policies won't be as different as you think they are, right? So yeah.
I just add that I think we've seen a lot of success in the movement against mass incarceration. We shouldn't forget that there's been a lot of success in the last 10 years. And also, so that's one point. A lot of stuff we've done has worked, even in the news, even in the propaganda sphere, like the news media by and large is no longer using mugshots or using certain language. Many news entities across the country have organized to stop them from doing stuff like that and have changed some of their practices. We also, the prison and jail population in the U.S. is 10% lower than it was. That those are, we should take time to celebrate that. Like, we were quite effective for a long time narratively. Now we're in a different moment now. I don't want to sugarcoat things. We're at a very scary moment where we may be, and liberals are walking us off this cliff too, but we may be walking off a cliff and there may be no way back. I don't know. But, setting that aside for just a second, there are kernels here and there. Like, so the 2020 uprisings weren't out of nowhere. There had been a lot of political education and organizing work after Ferguson that made it so that when that trigger event happened, so mass protest movements happen with certain triggers. They're just come out of nowhere. And maybe, it's hard to predict what's going to become a trigger event and when it's going to happen, whatever. But like, when that trigger happened, there were a lot more people that were ready, willing, and able. Those protests were much bigger and more sustained and had a much more complex intellectual foundation and on-ramps for people. Nowhere near enough. But the next time, maybe, so there, and the work we do now in the lull between trigger events is absolutely essential. It's definitely the right wing has been doing that. Definitely they've been preparing and organizing, in what some theorists of social movements call like a winter period. That's when a lot of the stuff happens underneath the soil, and that the right wing has definitely been doing that. And also, I'll just say that, like, so much of the work of people on the far left is much more difficult when a Democrat is in power, because most people just sort of trust the government more and trust the state more, and blah blah. So there may be openings now, especially as the people in power are like really going full, you can see that, for example, the support for Israel is at all-time or modern lows, particularly among young people. There are signs that people are starting to pay attention to some of the most horrific and brutal and grotesque injustices of our world, in it's reaching broader swaths of the population in some ways. And so I think there's a lot to build on. But we are in a moment where the kinds of formations and language that worked in 2016 and 2017, 2018, they're gone. And I don't know what it's going to exactly look like, but we need to be in this period thinking about, and that's, some of our work at Civil Rights Corps. That's why we're changing how we talk about some of our mass incarceration work. We're changing some of the work that we do. We're talking a lot more about families and the impact on family. We need to have a different way of talking about jails and prisons and the effect on who they hurt, who they harm, and anyway. So we're trying lots of. We didn't get a chance to talk about it tonight, and I also have the last chapter in the book is really about some of this stuff. But yeah, I think there are things that are positive to build on, and we just have to find those things together and work hard, because we're in a dark place.
Thank you. Want to echo the thanks for being here and sharing so much. I know I've learned a lot already. I was wondering if you could speak to the propaganda around the funding of the police, and specifically when, 2020, 2021, there's a lot of publicizing just how much our cities, these major cities, are spending on police instead of, a whole list of other issues that could more tangibly improve people's lives. And I feel like we've seen in the last year and a half some success with that, a similar discussion around the funding that's going towards Israel's military-industrial complex, as opposed to any host of issues in the social welfare sphere, especially with the cost of living being so high. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to the propaganda around squashing that argument, and how people are trained in a way to disregard the fact that sometimes as much as 20-30% of a city's budget is going towards policing, which doesn't have evidence-based benefits to those same constituents.
Yeah, lots of thoughts about that. One of my favorite chapters in the book is just about, I'll just there's so much to say about this, but I'll just do one narrow response, and that's the role of polls. One of the most effective propaganda tactics was to make people think that defunding was so unpopular, it was just futile. And yeah, okay, you might say that's nice for you, but that's never going to happen. So let's get real. Let's be pragmatic. Let's talk about real things, right? Defund is that's far left, So there was a concerted effort to lie to people about how popular that idea was. And it turned out that and my favorite example of this is the campaign of Kenneth Mejia, which I talk about a little bit in the book. He's this, I don't know, has anyone ever heard of Kenneth Mejia? He's this youngish accountant, housing rights kind of organizer, activist, I think, but he was an accountant who decided he was going to run for controller of the city of Los Angeles. And he made all these great TikTok videos with his 2 dogs, and he was very funny. And then he had all these billboards across LA, beautifully designed, great colors, great graphic design, just told people about the excesses of the police budget. And he was like, I'm a really great accountant, I'm just going to show you all these things. And then he had this group of teenagers who were coders who did all this really cool stuff with relating to police budget and all this stuff. One of their things is about dog parks, and they really got all these dog owners really interested in the investment and lack of investment in dog park. It was brilliant stuff. Mejia he ran in the same election that Karen Bass ran against Rick Caruso. That got a lot of the attention. And he ran against one of the most long-standing, powerful establishment politicians in Los Angeles, who was a city council person who then ran for controller. He trounced this person in the primary. Then they ran against him in the general election. He trounced him by even more. He got this unknown controller guy got more votes than Karen Bass. Okay, he was the most popular politician elected politician in Los Angeles maybe ever. Like, incredible. Now Karen Bass has done something very Trumpian now. She's like kind of defunded his office. She's contracted out separate accountants now because she doesn't want him doing, because he in office, he's continued to do this. He's just showing people the excesses of the LAPD, and it's very, very, very popular. And this chapter I have in the book shows that the news media kept reporting to us that defund was unpopular because they say, well, polls, people don't support defund. Keep in mind, though, that the only polls that ever get reported to you in the news media polls are expensive. So the only time a poll is done is when somebody with money wants to ask a certain question, okay? And those people get to decide what questions are asked, how they're asked, and what context is provided before you ask them. So I have this great chapter, I think, in the book. It's maybe a mediocre chapter about a great issue. My grandma has called it a great chapter, but and she's watching tonight. And she did proofread the book and found a typo that everybody else had missed. So she read it closely. But there's this great idea that I think is really empowering and interesting, where when in the same poll where a majority of people said they oppose defund, few questions later, and this was not printed in the news articles about the poll, a few questions later they were asked, do you support reducing the police budget by and giving that money to services like housing, healthcare, education? Supermajority supported it. Supermajority Republican, supermajority Independent, supermajority of Democrat. The group, it was a small sample size for this group, but the small sample size group that supported this policy the most were respondents with a police officer and their family. Okay? I'll let you make of that what you will. But that was completely erased from the mainstream news media. When you tell people the specifics of the policy, it's like, do you want more militarized cop cars and more PR employees of the police department, or do you want like a mobile health clinic in your community? People are like, I want a place where my kids can like get healthcare. It's not even, do you want like another teacher in your kid's school? It's like, I want another teacher. Like, it's just, so one of the ways they fought against this in the marketing of it is that they just completely erased the idea that these things are actually widely popular.
So I know we have some more questions in the room, but we also have some virtual questions that I want to make sure we get to because we got a great virtual audience with us tonight. So Arthur says, with regards to the power and role of police foundations, police fraternal organizations, and police unions, do you see any potential of a united front composed of progressive radical mass legal orgs and grassroots people power forming to combat them somehow, like campaigning to decertify police unions, for example, to win, of course, but if that proves too difficult, to also raise awareness and recruit more people to the movement?
I do. I'll also let you talk about this if you want from like a local, I mean, just really quick thing I would say is I do, but it's going to take the labor movement formally kicking these people out of their movement, right? They're not part of the labor movement. They shouldn't be, but a lot of the main unions represent guards and officers and then also it's going to take other people in the labor movement to understand, like teachers, nurses, doctors, home healthcare workers, whatever. There's lots of people to understand that like these city budgets are a zero-sum game, and any money that's going to the cops it's taking money away from them and their members. And it's not going to be like a few radical lefties alone. And it's not going to be a few radical lefties plus a few professors or a few nonprofit lawyers. But there are existing centers of power, like already organized unions of people whose interests are being concretely harmed by the levels of investment in our society. And if we can actually collect a united front of some of those people too, and a broad-based coalition, then I do think it's possible.
I think that's a good answer.
Cody says, could you explain in a little more detail how police departments coordinate with media and entertainment to sanitize their image, and what might people do to disrupt that pipeline?
Yeah, I think Cody's gonna like chapter 16. Yeah, so I think like it's everywhere. beneath every news story you read, there's this bustling underworld. You have to always think to yourself, how did this story get to this reporter? Who brought it to them? You know, I've anchors and producers and reporters coming to me being like, we don't want to be doing this, but you have to understand we are defunded ourselves. We have very limited resources, and every single day the police bring to us 14 stories. Not only do they bring the police reports, they bring audio, they bring video for our television news, they bring charts and graphs we can just put on air, they bring experts we can quote, they make their own people available for a quotation. There's this world that's producing, like they're almost producing the news for the news, and it's very hard to combat. And also, every TV show, every film you see that has touches on any of these issues, there's consultants there from the police, from the military industrial complex, from the consulting industry and the surveillance industry, who are shaping everything that's in that, from prosecutor offices. So there's a lot that can be done, I think. One thing that we did was we helped create the Center for Just Journalism. And one of the people working on that is a great person, Hannah Riley, who's here in Atlanta. And that organization helps news outlets change the pipeline of sourcing. So what might it look like if they took a different idea of a public safety beat, instead of camping a reporter outside the police precinct or taking the police blotter, or only meeting with the police as sources? What would it look like if local public defenders, civil rights lawyers, employment lawyers, if they had someone in landlord-tenant court? Right? It turns out people actually really love like a bad landlord of the week segment. People love to watch it. It's actually not true that people only want to watch the mugshots of poor people on their TV. They actually care about which playgrounds are testing for lead, and they actually care about which landlords are refusing to install smoke detectors. And it turns out a lot of people watch those local news segments. It's what they want from their local news. And if you can cultivate these networks of people who are bringing, so like these inspectors or these teachers or these nurses don't have a 40-person PR division. Like the LA sheriff has 42 full-time PR people. I'm not even talking about LAPD. I'm just about the sheriff's office. 42. So, like some of what we have to do, we're not going to get paid to do this, but in our communities, we organize around. Teachers get together once a week. They have lunch with the local news anchor. Once a week, public defenders get together and they send all this stuff to the reporter, or they start building relationships, or the local. You get the point. But basically, like, I have all these suggestions in the last chapter of the book about ways in which all of us can, and you know, my mother, for example, became a court watcher when she retired. So she just watches court along with Fiona Apple, and Fiona Apple's court watcher too. And she actually just released a song this week about it. It's brilliant though. It's amazing, right? Like they watch court, they document what happens, and then they give that stuff to the news, to civil rights lawyers, and other. Some of those court watching things turned into 2 major federal civil rights cases. They're just watching what the judges are doing every day, watching what the prosecutors are doing, watching what the cops are saying, and they're reporting it. Community people can do that. It's like a mutual aid. It's like an organizing. We can have our own little, like, you know, Copaganda groups. No matter what, if we have coding skills, if we're teachers, if we're lawyers, if we're directly impacted people and families. There's participatory defense hubs all over the country popping up where the families of people going through the legal process get together and they do their own reporting. And so we just helped a bunch of those families file ethics complaints against some judges in California for violating the law when their loved ones were in court. So there's so much that we can do to bring awareness to these stories, but we have to organize together to do it.
So this will be our last question. It's probably relatively brief. He says, have you, by any chance, done any research regarding Copaganda in Greece? Assuming you're Greek, have you done any research on that? Things have been wild there, especially in the last 6 years.
Yeah, I actually have not done much research on this, but I am open and willing to accept free trips to Greece. So if there's an interest in it, my family is actually from Cyprus, but Greek, and so I'd also be willing to accept free trips to Cyprus or really any of the islands.
The general Mediterranean.
Yeah.
For ground. All right, Costas, you heard it here first. You could make this happen with Alec.
That's actually my dad's name. That might actually be my dad.
Oh,
I don't
that's
even
hilarious.
know if that's. It might just be asking my own family for a free trip to Greece.
I mean, well, if your dad won't do it, who
Yeah.
can? I know we have many more questions in the room, but we are at time, so we're gonna transition to a book signing here in a moment. So if you want to ask your questions, you can do that while you're getting your book signed. We have Copaganda and Alec's first book up front. We also actually Kamau's book, which doesn't officially come out until next week, but we got copies. Oh no, it's already out. It's already out now, but it's up front as well. We're gonna do an event on it later this summer, so stay tuned for that. We're really excited, so you can get that signed by Kamau. We encourage folks who are watching online to click this teal button at the bottom center of the screen to buy the book from Charis. It really does help us when you do that. So we're going to say goodnight to you. We really appreciate you. Stay safe and stay well. And for all